The ground gave way with a sickening crunch, and within seconds, water was gushing out of the split PVC line like a burst artery under the sidewalk. Jared Locke dropped his wrench and lunged backward, barely avoiding the spray. "That's not irrigation," he muttered, eyes wide. Across the cul-de-sac, the HOA's landscaping crew stood frozen. 3 men in neon vests, one holding a saw he hadn't even bothered to turn off. They were the ones who'd made the cut, and they were standing over Jared's main water supply. The crew chief, Frank something, finally walked over, scratching his neck. "We thought it was runoff. Just part of the old system." Jared turned toward him, soaked from the knees down, fury radiating off him like heat. "That old system was the line feeding my house. You cut my home's water off. Completely. We were told to trench the edge, clear space for the HOA dog station." Jared blinked. He hadn't misheard. "You dug up my property line to install a dog waste bag dispenser. You'll have to take it up with the board," Frank said, already walking away. "No, you're not walking away from this. You just destroyed part of my home." It wasn't just the mistake, it was the tone. The absolute indifference, like Jared's home was a set piece, and the HOA was stage management, like they could punch a hole through his plumbing and shrug it off because they had a landscaping budget and a clipboard. Jared walked back toward his porch, shoes squelching in the mud, mind already racing. He tried the kitchen faucet, nothing. Tried the bathroom, dry. No toilet, no sink, no outside spigot. They hadn't just damaged the pipe, they'd severed it completely. Across the street, Linda Moreno stood watering her potted violets, watching the whole thing unfold with barely concealed interest. She was on the board. Treasure, he thought. The one always smiling during fines and speaking in passive-aggressive tones about compliance clarity. Jared met her gaze. "Your crew just cut my water line." "Technically," she replied, "that area falls within the HOA's easement. You're going to fix it. You'll need to file a maintenance reimbursement request." "You want me to file a form for something your contractor destroyed?" Linda shrugged, still watering. "That's the process." By noon the trench was still open. By 5 p.m., Jared had called every plumber in a 10-mile radius. Emergency rates were steep, and wait times were worse. One guy offered to swing by the next morning, for $700, just to diagnose the damage. The HOA didn't offer to cover a cent. Jared didn't sleep that night. Not just because the water was off, but because something about the way Linda had shrugged stuck with him. The implication was clear. They weren't going to fix it. Not unless he jumped through every hoop, paid for it himself, and accepted the regretful inconvenience with a smile. That wasn't going to happen. They wanted paperwork, they'd get paperwork. They wanted compliance. He'd show them what following the rules actually looked like, line by line, clause by clause. And by the time he was finished, they wouldn't just have to fix what they broke. They'd wish they'd never touched a single pipe on his property. Micah Navarro wasn't an impulsive man. He didn't shout. He didn't throw things. He didn't threaten lawsuits the minute something went wrong. But when he stood in front of the HOA's utility contractor holding a jagged piece of PVC pipe, the one they'd unearthed from his backyard like it was trash, he knew exactly what kind of man he was going to have to become to fix this. The HOA had accidentally severed the water line that connected Micah's house to the main grid. They hadn't given notice. They hadn't marked the property. They hadn't even knocked. They'd simply shown up one morning with backhoes and clipboards, intending to upgrade a shared line for the community restroom facilities located in the recreation center that backed up to Micah's property. But they hadn't reviewed the original plat map, because if they had, they would have known that part of the water system ran through a legacy easement, one the HOA didn't control. That line belonged to Micah, and now, so did the leverage. The first call Micah made wasn't to the HOA, it was to the city. He requested a copy of the original infrastructure blueprint from the building commission. He paid the expedited fee. He drove to the office himself, and when they handed him the roll of paper, he didn't open it there. He brought it home, spread it across his dining room table, and traced the route of the water line with a pencil, just to be sure. He found the exact connection point where his line had once run. Then he followed it down, across and under the patch of soil that now sat dry and mangled behind his garden. They hadn't just cut a pipe, they'd cut into his property rights. Next came the legal confirmation. Micah called Rena Lawton, a local civil attorney who had once helped him fight a property tax error that nearly cost him his home. She was sharp, quiet, and thorough, and exactly the kind of person who knew how to turn a mistake into an airtight claim. He sent her photos. He scanned the blueprint. He told her everything. They rerouted community plumbing through your private easement without permission, she asked, and disconnected mine to do it. Then they just handed you their faucet and the handle. She sent him a draft of a cease and desist letter within 48 hours. It was calm, precise, and devastating. Micah didn't deliver it to the board directly. He printed it and mailed it, registered with return receipt, and copied the city zoning office for good measure. He included before and after photos of the trench, the shattered pipe, the contractor's truck parked half on his lawn, and a signed statement from the neighbor who witnessed the dig. Then he did something the HOA never expected. He contacted a licensed plumber, not to repair the damage, but to isolate the valve. The very valve that controlled access to the rec center's water line. His plumber disconnected the HOA's temporary bypass and installed a locking cap, legal under state code, as long as it didn't interfere with active service. And since Micah's line was the original source, and since that source had been compromised without consent, his action was considered preservation, not obstruction. He took photos, filed a permit, and waited. The next day, a board member named Caitlin Griggs knocked on his door. She looked flustered, holding a folder and trying to smile. We're receiving complaints from residents that the clubhouse restrooms aren't functioning. That's correct. We believe it may be connected to a plumbing issue near your property. It is. He opened the door wider, not to invite her in, but to hand her a copy of the blueprint, the letter from Rena, and the invoice from his plumber. I'd advise the board to read carefully before moving forward. Especially Section 4. She glanced at the page. What's Section 4? The part where I notify you that any further attempt to access the line without my written consent will be considered trespassing under state law. She blinked. He didn't. Micah didn't smile when she left. He didn't gloat. He went back to his table, circled the easement again on the blueprint, and underlined the word recorded with a pen. The HOA wanted to play developer. They wanted to cut corners. Now they were going to learn what happened when you skipped the details. And while they scrambled to reconnect their precious facilities, Micah's water had already been restored. Clean, stable, and running through the same quiet pipe they should have left alone. The difference was, now he knew exactly where every line in the ground, and every line in the law was drawn. And so did they. The board expected complaints, but they weren't prepared for the crowd that showed up to the emergency HOA meeting. More than 40 residents packed into the makeshift meeting space inside Briar Glen Elementary's auditorium. It smelled faintly of old wood floors and cafeteria trays. The folding chairs were mismatched. The fans didn't work. And the irony of discussing infrastructure issues in a building with functioning bathrooms wasn't lost on anyone. Micah arrived 10 minutes early. He didn't come with signs or supporters. He brought only a black folder and a quiet kind of presence that drew attention without asking for it. Neighbors nodded to him as he passed. No one said a word. They didn't need to. Everyone already knew why he was there. Caitlin Griggs, still acting president since Marcy's resignation last spring, stood at the front of the room beside two remaining board members. She shuffled papers, took a sip from her thermos, and attempted to appear composed, even as the tension in the room grew denser by the minute. We've received numerous complaints about water access to the HOA Recreation Center, she began, her voice brittle and overly rehearsed. As you may know, this issue is currently being addressed by contractors and municipal liaisons, and we hope to resume normal operations within the week. A hand shot up in the third row. Micah didn't wait to be called on. How are you planning to do that? Exactly, without a legally accessible water source. Gasps didn't follow. Laughter didn't break out. The room simply turned in unison toward the man who wasn't raising his voice, but who everyone knew had already won the room. Caitlin stiffened. Mr. Navarro, this isn't an open floor discussion just yet. It should be. Because if we're talking about transparency, I think the community deserves to know that the only reason your facilities are dry is because your crew severed a line they never had the right to touch. She opened her mouth to respond, but Micah wasn't done. He opened the folder in his lap and removed a rolled blueprint, the infrastructure map he'd retrieved from the city, now laminated and highlighted. He handed a copy to the resident next to him and motioned for it to be passed forward. "This is the original site plan for my property, recorded with the city 26 years ago. It shows the location of the legacy easement privately held, running beneath what is now your clubhouse lawn. That line wasn't just critical to my home's water access. It also fed the junction to your restrooms." He paused, letting the weight settle. "You didn't mark it, you didn't verify it, and you didn't get my permission before digging it up." Board member Craig Levinson, who had barely spoken in the last 3 meetings, leaned forward with furrowed brows. "Are you suggesting the HOA acted illegally?" "I'm not suggesting anything. I'm stating it. You interfered with a privately held easement, and I've already retained legal counsel to back that up." He placed a second document on the folding table at the front. A cease and desist letter, notarized, signed by his attorney, and already submitted to the city. "I have every legal right to isolate and lock the cap on that line, which I've done." Someone near the back whispered, "That's why the rec center's still closed." Caitlin attempted to regain footing. "Even if that's true, this could have been handled quietly through mediation or internal review." Micah's voice remained even. "I tried that. I filed a complaint the day your crew broke ground. No one returned my call. No one emailed, and then I was issued a warning letter for obstruction of utility maintenance as if I had caused the damage myself." He held up the letter, photocopied, unsigned, printed from a generic HOA email with no direct contact information. "You didn't want resolution, you wanted silence." Now the murmurs began. They weren't chaotic. They were heavy. Residents flipping through the copies Micah had provided, pointing out highlighted sections, reading city codes aloud in hushed tones. Camille Tran, a resident who had lived 2 doors down from the rec center for over a decade, stood up. "Why are we just now learning that our board rerouted utilities through private property? Why wasn't this shared when the project was proposed?" Caitlin looked cornered. Because she was. The contractor was under the impression the land had been previously approved. "Then you hired the wrong contractor," Micah said, cutting in. "Because I was never contacted. And now your rec center is dry, your budget's bleeding, and your credibility is eroding." No one interrupted him. Because they didn't want him to stop. He hadn't raised his voice once. He hadn't dramatized anything. He had simply presented the truth, and it had done the damage for him. Caitlin sat down slowly, her shoulders tight. "We'll revisit this. With counsel. You'll do more than that," Micah said. "You'll issue a public acknowledgement that the HOA acted beyond its legal authority. You'll halt all planned utility expansions, and you'll compensate for the repairs I paid for out of pocket. Or I'll take this to the city council, to local press, and to every homeowner on your contact list, so they know how easily their rights could be next." The room didn't clap, but they nodded. And when Micah stepped back into his seat, it wasn't the posture of a man who had just delivered a threat. It was the posture of someone who had finally drawn a line. And this time, it was one the board would never be allowed to cross again. 3 days after the meeting, Micah received a hand-delivered letter, not from the HOA, but from an attorney representing their newly retained legal firm. It was printed on thick paper, enclosed in a pristine envelope, and sealed like a wedding invitation. Inside, the language was dressed up in formality, but the threat beneath it was obvious. "The HOA board demands that Mr. Navarro immediately restore functional access to the Briar Glen community facilities. Failure to do so may result in litigation." Micah read it 3 times before carefully placing it back in the envelope and setting it beside the coffee pot. Then he picked up the phone and called Rena. She didn't ask questions, she just listened, let out a slow exhale, and replied with practiced calm. "So they've officially decided to double down." Micah didn't laugh. He didn't need to. "I was hoping they'd be smarter than this." "They're not, but we are." That evening Rena filed a counterclaim, not a response letter, not a warning. A formal civil suit, citing unauthorized tampering of private infrastructure, destruction of personal property, and retaliatory action against a resident following a legally protected cease and desist. Attached to the suit was photographic evidence, city-verified easement maps, invoices from the plumbing contractor, and an affidavit from the neighbor who had witnessed the dig. It wasn't just thorough, it was surgical. and it landed like a punch to the stomach. The following day, residents woke up to something unusual: a public legal notice pinned to the HOA community board near the clubhouse. The paper was crisp. The wording was factual. The title said everything it needed to Navarro v. Briar Glen HOA, complaint for property interference and civil retaliation. Camila Tran took a photo and posted it to the private community Facebook group. By noon, half the neighborhood had seen it. By 3 p.m., someone leaked the story to the local newspaper. The article ran with the headline, "Resident Sues HOA After Waterline Blunder Shuts Down Neighborhood Facilities." It included a brief summary of the suit, a quote from Micah's attorney, and a response from the HOA that read like it had been written by someone trying to apologize without admitting fault. "We are working swiftly to resolve a temporary infrastructure dispute with one of our residents. At this time, we cannot comment further due to pending legal review." But the damage was already done, and it wasn't just reputational. Behind the scenes, HOA Treasurer Brian Atwell sent an internal email to board members outlining the financial risk of continuing litigation. It leaked within 48 hours. The email stated plainly that the HOA's liability insurance wouldn't cover civil suits involving easement violations, and that a prolonged legal battle could bankrupt their discretionary fund. Board members started panicking. 2 of them submitted resignation letters the next morning. Micah didn't comment publicly. He didn't need to. The system was finally doing what it should have done all along. The real reckoning came when city zoning officials reviewed the HOA's most recent permit application, one they'd submitted months earlier to expand the recreation center's restrooms and upgrade the piping. It had been fast-tracked, rubber-stamped by a junior associate who hadn't noticed the conflict with the private easement. Now, under public scrutiny, that same office reopened the file and launched an internal investigation. Micah was contacted for a formal statement. He gave it calmly, with documentation to back every word. The permit was suspended pending review. And just like that, the HOA's entire renovation plan, restrooms, maintenance room, outdoor water access was put on indefinite hold. In a closed-door meeting, the board met with their attorney to consider options. Only 3 members remained. 2 favored settling quickly. The third, Caitlin, still wanted to push forward, still convinced that Micah had embarrassed them, and that bending now would invite further rebellion. But the pressure was already winning. Residents weren't just frustrated, they were angry, and they were watching. Micah's attorney received a call the next morning. It was the HOA's lawyer, requesting a confidential mediation session. They wanted to discuss terms. Micah declined. He had no interest in backroom apologies. He wanted this resolved the right way, on paper, on record, and in full view of the community that had been left in the dark for far too long. That weekend, a group of homeowners gathered in Micah's driveway, not to rally, not to protest. They brought baked goods, fold-out chairs, notebooks. They had read the suit. They had read the bylaws, and for the first time they felt empowered enough to ask a question that had always been whispered in corners. What if we rewrote the rules ourselves? Micah didn't offer to lead them. He offered to share everything. The blueprints, the legal process, the paper trail. He made copies for anyone who asked. Because the reckoning wasn't just about plumbing. It was about precedent, about what happens when people stop backing down, about how power shifts not in explosions but in the quiet moments where someone decides they're not afraid to say no more. The notice board outside the clubhouse hadn't changed in years until now. Instead of the usual flyers about landscaping fines and seasonal trash pickup, it featured something residents weren't used to seeing: a formal apology from the HOA board. The letter was printed in plain black ink on official letterhead. It didn't use phrases like unfortunate miscommunication or regrettable inconvenience. It named the incident for what it was: an unauthorized disruption of a resident's water access resulting in temporary loss of service, legal action, and board-level accountability. It was signed by 2 remaining members. The third had quietly stepped down the night before. Micah didn't go read the notice. He didn't need to. Half a dozen neighbors texted him photos within an hour of it being posted. One even brought him a printed copy inside a manila envelope like he was a councilman. He didn't gloat. He didn't post. He poured himself a glass of water, cold, clear, uninterrupted, and stepped onto his back patio as the sprinkler system ticked on across his freshly reseeded lawn. The hum of water hitting grass had never sounded more like justice. The lawsuit hadn't been settled yet, but the impact had already arrived. The board was no longer functioning as a unit. They were answering directly to the community now, holding emergency meetings in borrowed spaces, with residents asking questions no one had dared ask before. Why were easements never mapped properly before construction? What other utility changes were made without homeowner approval? How much of our dues went toward legal counsel we didn't agree to hire? The answers weren't satisfying, and that was exactly why they mattered. 1 week after the fallout began, a group of residents submitted a formal petition to restructure the HOA entirely. They wanted term limits, public oversight, rotating leadership, and a full audit of the past 5 years' expenditures, especially those that had been authorized by Marcy and rubber-stamped without review. Micah didn't start the petition, but his name was at the top, printed cleanly, underlined by 10 signatures before the day was over. Meanwhile, the city sent an update of its own. After reviewing the full report from RENA's legal team, the Municipal Zoning Office issued a formal suspension of all construction permits filed under the Briar Glen HOA's name. Every planned project was halted. The restrooms at the clubhouse remained sealed off. No new infrastructure work could begin until the board completed a mandatory re-inspection of all utility lines crossing private property, past and present. It wasn't a slap on the wrist, it was a full stop. Residents noticed the silence, not just in plumbing, but in tone. The board had stopped issuing fines, stopped sending newsletters, stopped pretending they were the authority and started realizing they were the help. People stopped whispering about the board like it was untouchable, and they started making phone calls, started asking for records, started organizing. Micah spent those days quietly rebuilding what had been torn up. The trench in his backyard had been filled in and leveled. The sod was taking root again. The crushed edge of his vegetable bed had been rebraced with fresh cedar. The contractor who'd done the damage never showed their face again, and the HOA hadn't tried to send a replacement. The soil was healing. So was he. Camila stopped by with coffee on a Thursday. She didn't stay long, just long enough to say, "Whatever you need to finish this fight, we're with you." Micah thanked her and handed her a printed copy of the updated easement laws. She took it like it was a baton, not paperwork. And that's exactly what it was now, a handoff. One story moving into the hands of the next. That Saturday, a new sign appeared outside the clubhouse painted by local kids on a repurposed plank of wood. It read, "Respect your neighbors, or you'll learn the hard way who owns the pipes." Micah didn't put it there. He didn't need to. The message had already made its rounds, and it wasn't about revenge. It was about responsibility. By the end of the month, the community had voted to form a resident oversight council, a rotating body of 5 non-board members who would be required to review all future projects affecting shared or private infrastructure. Micah wasn't on the list. He declined the nomination. But he handed in a binder labeled "Records You'll Need." Inside were city maps, easement files, redacted emails, and one handwritten note at the front: "Don't let anyone treat your silence like an agreement, ever again." The fallout didn't just shake the board, it rewired the neighborhood. The rules still existed, but now, so did the people behind them. And for the first time in a long time, Briar Glen felt less like a governed property and more like a place where people actually lived. The settlement arrived on a Thursday. It came in a thin white envelope marked "Confidential," though by now, nothing about the situation was private. Micah didn't open it right away. He left it on the kitchen counter, untouched, and stepped outside into the sunlight as the sprinklers rose across his yard. He listened for the steady pulse of water, not as a homeowner checking for pressure, but as someone making sure the world hadn't slipped off balance again. It hadn't. The lines were quiet. The valves were steady. Everything was flowing exactly where it should. When he finally opened the envelope later that evening, he didn't smile at the number. He didn't care about the money. It wasn't about reimbursement. It was about recognition. A legal admission that the HOA had acted without consent, without caution, and without the right. The check was stapled to a 1-page statement, dry, corporate, and unsigned by any individual. Just the HOA's letterhead above a paragraph that read, "This resolution does not constitute an admission of wrongdoing." Micah folded it twice and slid it into a drawer without reading the rest. He wasn't interested in their denial. He had already built his own kind of truth. Across the street, kids were playing in the driveway again, scooters slicing the pavement, chalk drawings stretching toward the curb. The community felt different now. Not louder, not rebellious, just more awake. People had stopped whispering about the HOA behind hedges. They were writing bylaws now, challenging motions, electing neighbors they trusted instead of defaulting to whoever spoke the loudest. Micah had been asked to serve on the new infrastructure review board. He declined, politely. "I didn't do this to lead anything," he'd told them. "I did it so no one else would have to." He spent the next weekend in the yard, rebuilding the planter boxes that had been crushed when the trench was dug. His hands were steady, movements deliberate, not because he was rushing to finish, but because he was giving the work the patience it deserved. The same patience he wished the board had given before they tore into what they didn't understand. By Sunday evening, the boxes were back in place, cedar planks screwed tight, soil refilled, seedlings planted. He stood over the rows with his gloves still on, brushing dirt from his palms as the sun dipped low across the fence line. There were no speeches, no announcements, just him, and the sound of a faucet running clean water into a watering can. Camila passed by with her dog just as he stepped off the porch. She paused at the edge of the walkway. "Looks good," she said. "Feels better. Think they learned anything?" Micah glanced toward the clubhouse in the distance, where the new construction signs were still boxed in with caution tape. "Maybe not all of them, but enough." She nodded once and kept walking. That night, Micah made a cup of tea and sat on the back steps. He looked out across his yard, where the grass was healing and the lines below had been restored, not just physically, but legally, personally, and permanently. The past few months had burned away something hollow, and in its place, something strong had taken root. He had defended what was his without shouting. He had drawn a boundary and held it. And now, the water flowed exactly where it was meant to, without permission, without apology, and without interruption. He didn't just win. He restored what they never should have touched in the first place, and that was enough.